Shalom, I'm Shani Tarragon, and welcome to the podcast Secrets of the Scroll, Hidden Messages of Megillat Esther by Matan Mizrahi, powered by the Walter Foundation. In this series, we're going to explore textual allusions, literary messages that are hidden in the text of Megillat Esther, teaching us messages of not only the story itself, but allusions to the other 23 Sfarim of Tanakh. Please join me on this remarkable journey of learning through Tanakh through the eyes of Megillat Esther. Today, we're going to explore the allusions in Megillat Esther with Sefer Daniel, and perhaps that is the most explicit and really most natural connection between two stories in Tanakh, both placed in a similar, not only geographic area, but also during a very similar time period, so much so that historians even debate whether or not Esther is written with the basis of Daniel chronologically, or maybe Daniel written with Esther in mind. We're certainly going to adopt the former approach, namely that Esther, not only taking place later, but written later, really is going to draw allusions to Sefer Daniel. So much so that not only do both Sfarim begin with an exposition of the Jews in Galut, Daniel in particular, years earlier, actually speaking about how Daniel ended up in exile, first in Babylonia, and then, as we know, the story of Daniel continues as the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. We hear that he continues from the Babylonian court to the Persian court, which obviously is the same court of Esther. All the more so, Chazal conserved the personality of Daniel in Sefer Esther with the character of Hatach, that middleman between Mordechai and Esther, teaching us that, albeit he may have been demoted, as Chazal learned by virtue of the fact that he asked for a few days before offering an answer to Nebuchadnezzar regarding his true allegiance, but he still is Bishar HaMelech. He still is in an important position of kingship. What we would like to show, or what we're going to learn together really today, is not only to appreciate the various allusions and comparisons between the Sfarim, but actually to prove once more, specifically through Sefer Daniel, how Daniel could even say certain ideas, mention certain aspects of life for Jews in Chutz La'aretz, in ancient Babylonia and Persia, in such a way that Esther couldn't. And this only corroborates our thesis that Esther had to write certain ideas in a code form by virtue of the fact that her work is going to be censored, it's going to be written, it's going to be sent to the 127 lands of Achashverosh, and therefore, if printed by the royal printing press, then she can say everything that she wants to say, but not to worry, because she knows that you have Sefer Daniel in front of you, and Daniel will be able to say certain ideas explicitly. So the secrets of the scroll, for this, in order to understand Megillat Esther, you definitely need the scroll or the book of Daniel in front of you simultaneously. So for those who don't have Sefer Daniel open in front of them right now, that's okay, because it's enough to recognize common themes, common words, common ideas that we're going to see throughout both of these Sfarim. For example, both of the stories tell of the king's court and the promotion and the advancement of even Jews who are in Galut at the time, who are going to reach very high positions, not just Esther and Mordechai by the end of Megillat Esther, but we see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they're going to be in the king's court. In both stories, we have Daniel, who is given, just like Mordechai, the Tabat HaMelech. So obviously this brings us back also to Sefer Bereshit, as we mentioned there with our allusions of Megillat Esther to the stories of Yosef, another not only successful Jew in exile, but ultimately the paradigm, the precedent for all the future successful Jews who are going to advance in government. We have the Tabat HaMelech in both stories. We have the advisors who always surround the king, and not only surround the king, but both in Sefer Daniel and in Sefer Esther, we have the king asking his advisors, his yoatzim, his yodei ha'itim, his chachamim, his sarisim, his eunuchs all around him, again, which also tell us if there are so many eunuchs, it must be that there are a lot of women in the palace of the king as well. This complete obsession with the women and the harem, all the more so emphasized in Sefer Esther, but clearly evident in Sefer Daniel. Also, the entire courtyard culture, and by that I mean everything that we find in Megillat Esther, the mishtaot of the king, the ostentatious behaviors of the king, the superfluous materialism of the kingship, the parties, or really they're more feasts in the courtyard. That is going to be evident both in Daniel, for example, Perek Hey, but we also find them 10 times mentioned throughout Megillat Esther. We also have the selection, the idea of specific advisors being selected, and a process of selection, just like what we generally coin the beauty contest of Megillat Esther, which we're going to learn today is really about selection of who is the most tovat mar'eh, who is the best looking. We're going to revisit a similar selection process in Sefer Daniel and perhaps see a more morbid or dark side to the story of Megillat Esther through the allusions to Sefer Daniel. We also have Jews who are commanded to bow and refuse to do so. And here is an excellent example of how the allusion helps to clarify part of the plot, part of the theme in Megillat Esther. Lo yichra v'lo yishtachabeh. It's not just going to be Mordechai, but we also hear of Daniel, who won't bow down, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, who won't bow down, which is a little surprising when we open up the story of Mordechai, who refuses to bow down to Haman, because Esther bows down, and it seems as if people are bowing down to Haman, they must also be bowing down to the king. We don't hear about Mordechai's refusal to bow down to the king. Lo kara, lo yichra, lo yishtachaveh. That terminology, the double terminology, appears throughout Daniel as well. And by Daniel, we find that kriya and hishtachavaya, that literally bowing down, prostrating oneself before the foreigner, before the king, was actually a form of avodah zarah. In Sefer Daniel, we hear of a huge statue that was made to honor the king, and different ways of worshiping the king when one hears music at a certain time. And therefore, what Esther can't necessarily divulge to the reader, namely that, of course, this kriya and hishtachavaya is also an expression of worshiping the person as a deity, and albeit expressed through Chazal, the pshat of Esther, if read together with Sefer Daniel, is going to help us appreciate the story. In addition, even the basic idea of the plot, and certainly the midah keneged midah that we see in Megillat Esther, namely that Haman, who planned to have Mordechai hanging on a tree for treason, like Bigtan and Teresh, lo and behold, he in the end is going to be hanging on a tree together with his 10 sons, who are also going to be hanged. This midah keneged midah we find also in Daniel with regard to his adversaries. For example, they who wanted to throw Daniel into the Kivshan Ha'ish. By there we see the salvation of actually his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah in the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the Gulf Harayot in the lion's lair. What does Nebuchadnezzar do after he sees the salvation of Daniel? He throws, again, all of the advisors who wanted to put him into the lion's den. He puts them in the lion's den. What does he do to all those who accuse Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of literally a mutiny against the king, of not properly showing the king respect? He throws them into the fiery furnace. The midah keneged midah plot of both stories seems to be very evident. But there are also similar cultural motifs. Not only do we find that each one of the Jews who make their way into the palace are going to be afforded not just their Jewish name, but a Persian name, and both by the story of Daniel and all of his peers, they not only have their Hebrew names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, but we're also going to hear about their Babylonian names. So too, Esther, Hadassah. Esther really has a Hebrew name, but she'll be known as Esther, certainly, in the king's court. And Mordechai, and did we ever think about their names? Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai resonating with Marduk, literally the Persian god at the time that Cyrus mentions in his proclamation? And how about Esther, very similar to Ashtart, again, the goddess of fertility for Persia and for ancient Mesopotamia? So it seems that they have very, very assimilated Persian idolatrous names, obviously for the sake of the king's court. Daniel will also help clarify certain somewhat ambiguous terms that we find in Megillat Esther. For example, when we see that Mordechai Yoshe Bishar HaMelech, okay, that seems very nice, that he's sitting by the king's gate. It's only in Sefer Daniel that we hear that someone who sits by the king's gate is in fact a very important person. That means that he's a member of the king's court. So we need to really read these stories side by side. But obviously, there are further messages. We know that with regard to canonization of Tanakh, that Chazal were very selective with regard to which Svarim are going to be perpetuated for time yonder. And albeit we find by Esther that she does have to encourage Chazal, the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, Kitvuni Lidorot. It seems that her Sefer is also a little bit redundant. Not only is it placed later, basically a generation after Daniel, but it also seems to repeat a very similar story. Just like Yosef, just like Daniel, Esther and Mordechai also succeed even when there are plots to thwart their success. They happen to be able to overcome. Clearly the messages of HaKadosh Baruch Hu helping out. As a matter of fact, Daniel overtly mentions Shem Hashem, turning to Hashem, davening to Hashem. Now we definitely understand why Esther cannot incorporate such religious ideas into her very secular work, which is going to be censored by the Persian government, by perhaps even Achashverosh himself. Nonetheless, and why not just include Daniel? What is the point of Megillat Esther with all of these various resonances and very not just explicit allusions to the story of Daniel, but basically almost a copy and paste type of plot that we find over and over again? Daniel, in addition to hearing of the personal threats against him and his dedication to Hashem and his advancement in the king's court during a time of exile in Babylonia and Persia respectively, by him we also find his eschatological dreams, not only the dreams like Yosef that he was able to interpret for Nebuchadnezzar, not only, again, very scary, but also the turning points of night scenes of dreams that he manages to interpret because he attributes them to Hashem. So one would think that between these two Sfarim, Daniel is definitely the more religiously oriented, only begging the question from all of us, why do we need Megillat Esther? Why, in fact, do Chazal say, let's canonize the Sefer? What allusions is Esther not only drawing from Daniel, but perhaps clarifying as well? What's interesting is that Daniel is written, as we open it up, primarily in Aramaic. And even though there are, as we open up the first parak, there definitely is Hebrew, we are supposed to get a sense that we're in a foreign government. Esther, though, writes in Hebrew, keeping in mind that, obviously, the officers of the king, the Yodei Ha'itim, also know the different languages. But this already tells us something with regard to the clarification, Esther writing and identifying, as we discuss also with our allusions to Sefer Ruth, identifying the Malchut really as a Jewish Malchut, even though it's in a foreign country. Daniel is much more assimilated and basically is going to help the foreign government itself advance by interpreting the grandiose dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, his rise to power, and ultimately his fall and the succession of the ensuing empires. Even some of the words that we find textually also resonate from one Sefer to the next. As a matter of fact, there are certain words that only appear in Sefer Esther, in Sefer Daniel, and in Megillat Esther. They're nearly hapex legomena, what we generally call milot or milim yechidaiyot b'mikra, that they only appear within a specific context. For example, the word partamim, only in Megillat Esther and in Sefer Daniel, and the longest word that we have in Tanakh, ve'achashtar penim. All of those officers, the messengers of the king, that are going to relay and ultimately send and read the Megillot throughout the various lands. So this already tells us something about the association between these Sfarim. The word tokef, that only appears by Esther and Daniel. The word dat, that albeit we find it also in Sefer Dvarim, certainly is emphasized both in Daniel and in Esther, leading the reader to ask, what is the dat? What is the law? What's the law? Both the Jewish law and how is Jewish law going to be upheld when there's a different law that sets the cultural tone in Babylonia and Persia, respectively. For example, Megillat Esther, Hadat, again, Hadat Nitna B'Shushan Habira. The law is that on the 13th of Adar, every Persian has the right to, and even responsibility, to go and kill the Jews and basically take their money and bring it to the government. So we basically have very strange laws that are certainly not going to be in the best interests of the Jews. Or Hashtiya Kadat. That's how Megillat Esther opens. Drinking is the law. Can you imagine? You don't even need a required minimal age. Everyone is supposed to drink. You don't even have to force them because that really is the dat, the law that sets the culture of the time. So with all of this in mind, of course, there are clarifications. Of course, the allusions help us appreciate the message all the more. But what we're going to do right now is take a look at the first parak of Daniel, which we find is not only in Hebrew, but is going to be the chapter that is most replete with allusions drawn into Megillat Esther. And I believe that if we take a look at this chapter in particular, then we'll understand not only the secret messages of the Megillah, but we're going to understand timeless lessons that Mordechai and Esther are going to be teaching us through allusions to Daniel. And I'd like to think at this moment, Rabbi David Foreman, who first showed me the perhaps most basic allusion that we're going to see mentioned between Esther and Daniel, and various messages that can then be expounded upon based on this. So let's open up together Daniel Parak Aleph, which from the very beginning is going to sound very familiar. So I'm going to ask all of you, wonderful listeners and learners, to be drawn into this as well, to remember that we're now in first Daniel's time period, the context of Galut Bavel, of the Babylonians, whom, if we remember, based on the Tanakh, we hear about Nebuchadnezzar, his son who succeeds him, Evil Merodach, and then the successor thereafter, Belshazzar, who, as we find in Tanakh, the next king is Koresh Melech Paras, teaching us that it must be that Koresh conquered Belshazzar. I'm smiling as I know that historians say that just as there are many more than 3 or 4 Persian kings, there also must have been many more than just 3 Babylonian kings. Nonetheless, this is the context that is told to us in Daniel, בשנת 3 למלכות יהויקים מלך יהודה, בא נבוכדנצר מלך בבל ירושלים ויצר עליה. Already we note a contrast. Esther begins in the 3rd year of Achashverosh, who Achashverosh. Daniel is בשנת 3 למלכות יהויקים מלך יהודה. And even though it's because chronologically, Sefer Daniel begins with the basic exposition of teaching us how Daniel ended up in Babylonia, nonetheless, by beginning Megillat Esther, ויהי בימי אחשוורוש, הוא אחשוורוש, המלך מהודו ועד כוש, 127 מדינה, בשנת 3 למלכו, basically Esther is saying, do you see a difference between what's going on in Megillat Esther and what's going on in Daniel? Daniel is still written with a perspective and the context of Jewish history, with a Jewish king, with Yehoiakim, the son of Yoshiyahu, in mind. Whereas Esther is saying, we are so assimilated. We now don't even associate with any Judean kingship. We are in exile and we are under complete foreign rulership of Achashverosh. Vayitena Adonai biado et Yehoiakim melech Yudah, ומקצת כלי בית האלוקים, והביאם ארץ שנר בית אלוהיו, ואת הכלים הביא בית אוצר אלוהיו. And here we hear of another allusion that resonates from Sefer Daniel to Megillat Esther, wherein he was given, again, not only does he take Yehoiakim, as we know, basically he kills him off, Nebuchadnezzar, at the time that Yehoiakim rebels against him, but also, again, here it's recorded the 3rd year of Yehoiakim. In Yirmiyahu, it's recorded as the 4th year of Yehoiakim, but we hear that not only is Yehoiakim basically going to be captured and ultimately killed by Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar also takes the Klei Beit HaElokim. He is going to take from the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash. So when Esther writes, V'kelim mikelim shonim, you're supposed to appreciate this is not just about the magnificent Mikasa and the beautiful, beautiful silverware and the beautiful utensils that Achashverosh shows off at his party, as we certainly see from the context of Chur Karpas Tchelet Argaman. It's a reference directly to the Kelim of the Beit HaMikdash. And the allusion, certainly to the beginning of Sefer Daniel, tells us this, that of course he took the Kelim of the Beit HaMikdash and he brought it into his own temples. Vayomer HaMelech Lashpenaz Rav Sarisav Lavi Mibnei Yisrael Umizera HaMelucha Umin HaPartamim. And he commands his own generals and officers to bring, this is before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in 586. Again, this is going to be in the year, basically, 605, in the fourth year of Yehoiakim. Again, keeping in mind that this is still before the exile of Yehoiachin, his son, known as the Galut of the Harash and the Masker, the aristocracy. So we're still speaking, more or less, and 18 years before the Churban, 19 years before the Churban, Nebuchadnezzar had already commanded to bring some of the aristocracy, to bring some of the Bnei Melucha, of the family of the monarchy, to bring them, basically, Mibnei Yisrael, to bring them to exile. Yiladim, here was the first, unfortunately, kinder transport, not as salvation, but as exile. Bring children. Here we clearly see how Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, as opposed to the Assyrians, who wanted to acculturate everyone and basically completely eradicate the Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, the Babylonians were okay with Jews retaining their own religion. Even, as we know, post the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, they allowed for Jews, until the assassination of Gedaliah, to stay in the land, to be able to maintain the land as long as they contributed their taxes to the Babylonian government. So too, the beginning of Sefer Daniel tells us that he wanted the children brought to basically be raised in the culture of Babylonia and contribute to Babylonian culture. Which children? Yiladim asher ein bahem kolmum, v'tovei mareh, umaskilim b'chol chokhmah, v'yodei dat, umivinei mada, v'asher koach bahem la'amod b'echal hamelech, ulelamdam sefer v'lashon kasdim. This pasuk seems to be quite neutral, right? Bring children who don't have any blemish, they're physically wonderful, they're tovot mareh, basically, they are very good looking, bring the finest, the smartest, the maskilim, b'chol ha'chokhmah, the ones who score a perfect score on their SATs and their psychometry, and they know da'at, umevinei mada, and they took A-levels and chamesh yichidot, as we would say today, in every science, v'asher koach behem la'amod behechal hamelech, and that they also have physical stamina to be able to stand in the palace of the king. Now, this is more similar to, I would call, the British Guard, the Royal Guard, that literally have to stand not just for 2 or 4 hour rotations, but literally all day. We're already getting a sense that he says, choose the cream of the crop, the best, and they are going to be brought to the land of Babylonia, and they're going to be taught the Chaldean, hence the Babylonian culture. Vayiman lahem hamelech dvar yom biyomo. And the king will give them as a mana. He will give them as a portion, mipat bag hamelech. Do you remember we discussed with regard to the association and allusions to the Yosef story? We saw Bigtan and Teresh, and we saw that Bigtan, we know from Daniel, is Mr. Bag, which means the pot. He is the baker in the story, which means that Nebuchadnezzar in this context said, this is going to be the diet. Let's see how many of these young children will survive with this diet. Now, this is not a favor. This is not the graciousness of the king. At first glance, it seems that he's going to provide a wonderful opportunity for these young children to be promoted in his court. I'd like for us to examine this in a different light. This is actually the selection of a concentration camp. Namely, bring the only ones who even have a chance of survival and give them the most basic nourishment, which is really insufficient. Give them every day mipat bag hamelech, literally a slice of bread of the king, umiyen mishtav, and give them of the wine of the king, and that's going to be their diet. Now, any nutritionist today will tell you that that is insufficient caloric intake for young children, and also between the carbohydrates and the alcohol, certainly not very nutritious. And let's see, this is basically a lahavdil, please forgive me, a Mengele experiment. Again, let's see if they can be raised this way. Ulagadlam shanim shalosh. And we're going to raise them this way for 2 or 3 years. Umiksatam, knowing that many of them are not going to survive. Ya'amdu lefnei hamelech. Only some of them will survive. It's not that some of them will be selected. It's that only some of them are going to remain. Vayhi bahem ibnei Yehuda. And those children who were taken, imagine, these are 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And just as we find in Esther, Vayasem lehem sar hasarisim, they are given their own eunuchs who are going to oversee them. These are more guards. Picture them almost like SS guards. And they change their names. Okay, they don't give them numbers, but they change their names and eradicate their identities. He names Daniel Belshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael becomes Meshach, Azariah becomes Abednego. Vayasem Daniel alibo, asher lo yitgael bepakbag hamelech. And that's why we need to know Sefer Daniel before we open up Megillat Esther, because Daniel decides on his own, not because of Hilchot Kashrut, not because of any dietary laws or restrictions, but because he decides that he does not want to disgust himself with the diet of the king. Even though one can argue, halachically, this is pikuach nefesh. He should eat whatever it is that they give him. But he decided, again, thinking of all those remarkable Jews in the concentration camp who would not eat on Yom Kippur, knowing that, again, the results would be horrific. And they would be punished for this. Daniel decides that he is not going to completely rid himself of his upbringing. He decides he does not want to disgust himself with the patbak hamelech uviyin mishtav. So what does he do? Vayivakesh misar hasarisim asher lo yitgael. He requests of, basically, the head eunuch, is it okay if you change my diet? Then I don't want to eat this. Vayitain ha'elokim et Daniel lechesed u'lerachamim lefnei sar hasarisim. Reminiscent of the Yosef story, but very absent in the Esther story, that Elokim is here. And with the same words that we find in the Esther story, vatisach chen v'chesed lifaneha, and lifanav in with regard to the Sar HaSarisim, with regard to Hegai Yisris HaMelech, here Esther is basically saying, I know that Elokim is behind it, but I can't say it. But if you know Daniel, then you know that there's almost an identical pasuk that says exactly that God puts the favor and the chesed and the rachamim of Daniel, the Chesed Rachamim in particular, before the head eunuch. Vayomer Sar HaSarisim leDaniel, little problem though. Yareani et Adoni HaMelech, asher mina et malchalchem. I'm afraid of my chief officer, i.e. the king. He's the one who apportions your food. Vet mishtechem, asher lama yireh pnechem, zoafim min hayeladim asher begilchem, v'chiyavtem et roshi lamelech. He's going to see that if I deny giving you this food, you're going to end up emaciated. You're going to look very different than everyone else, and I'm going to get in trouble. And basically, v'chiyavtem et roshi lamelech. This also tells us about a little bit of not just the courtyard culture, but the political culture. Off with my head. That's what the king does. If he suspects any possibility of treason, then I'm going to be hanged. Vayomer Daniel el hameltzar. So Daniel decides he won't go through the Sar HaSarisim, through the upper officers, but instead the meltzar. Yes, we know this word in modern day Hebrew, literally a waiter, and this is where Eliezer ben Yehuda extrapolated it from Sefer Daniel, a meltzar, a lowly officer. Asher mina Sar HaSarisim al Daniel Hanani Mishael v'Azariah. The Sar HaSarisim had appointed someone else to take care of these 4 children in particular, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael v'Azariah, na et avadecha yamim asara. And he asks of the Meltzar, let's do a 10-day experiment. V'yitnu lanu min hazeroim v'nochla umayim v'nishteh. He recognizes that this Meltzar, a lowly officer, is also subject to the whims of the king. And therefore, very cautiously, Daniel says, this is in your best interest. This is what we're going to do. You take our food and instead give us literally grains, give us seeds and water. And that's what we'll eat. We'll survive on a purely vegan diet. V'yira'u lefanacha mar'inu, u'mareh hayeladim ho'chlim et patbak hamelech, v'kasher tireh aseh ma'avadecha. And if you're afraid of how we're going to look, let's just try this out for 10 days. And then we'll compare the king's diet of bread and wine with our literally grain only, are seeded diet. Vayishma lahem ledavar hazeh. V'yinasem yamim asara. Now, of course, the Maltzar will do this because he also is going to gain. Namely, he'll be able to eat their food. Sure enough, by the end of the experiment, their countenance is much better. And the Meltzar continues to do this and give them the food. Basically, the Zeronim, Vayeladim ha'ele, Arbatam natan lahem Elokim, Mada v'askel b'chol sefer v'chochma v'Daniel hevin b'chol chazon v'chalomot. And what happens at the end of this 3-year trial period, 3 years of literally a concentration camp, of eating the bare minimum, of having measured water to drink, and now, after 2-3 years, let's see who the survivors are. And the ones who had the greatest stamina and the ones who passed all the tests were in fact these four. Asher bikesh mehem hamelech v'yimseim eser yadot kol hachartumim hashafim asher b'chol malchuto v'hi Daniel at shnat achat l'koresh hamelech. What a beautiful exposition. Not only do we find that that's how Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah ended up in the king's court by surviving these very, very difficult conditions, but we also find that this is the perfect background for Megillat Esther, Vayhi Daniel at Shnat Achat l'Koresh HaMelech, and as we've already learned, Koresh being the first of the Persian kings, Achashverosh set, and the story of Esther, in fact, set in that setting. What is so significant? Why do we have to hear about these manot? Well, Esther is going to draw allusions to these manot, and sometimes we, unfortunately, read the stories of Megillat Esther, as mentioned in our introduction, in a very elementary way, maybe because if we read them in a sophisticated fashion, it'll be a little too traumatic. So the same way that we wouldn't necessarily expose younger elementary school children to stories and pictures and details of the Holocaust until they're old enough to be able to literally to process this information, to be able to almost understand the difficulties and to be able to appreciate and internalize the messages, so too, we're now going to adopt a more sophisticated approach to how we see Esther's manner of entering into the king's court. If you remember, we hear from Memuchan, the beginning of Perek Bet, once Vashti is not killed, by the way. She's just banished to the harem, which probably means that eventually she'll also either starve to death, be killed by the other women, whatever the case may be. And the Narei HaMelech tell him, then you should go look for Na'arot Betulot Tovot Mar'eh. We have a very similar qualification, a similar, one can argue, process of selection that's going on based on Sefer Daniel. And sure enough, Vayafked HaMelech, Pekidim B'chol Medinot Malchuto, Vayikbetzu et Kol Na'ara Betula Tovat Mar'eh, El Shushan HaBira, El Beit HaNashim, El Yad Hege, Sris HaMelech Shomer HaNashim, V'naton Tamrukehen. You need the background of Sefer Daniel in order to appreciate this illusion. Basically, Esther is saying, oh my gosh, even once we were under Achashverosh's reign, there was another selection process. There was another Platz. There was another abduction from, not from Yerushalayim to Bavel, but basically from our homes to the king's palace. And what were the qualifications? You had to be a Na'ara Betula. So keep in mind that these are young women. These are women aged 10, 11, 12, 13, and who are bitulot tovot mar'eh. They are all the qualification for the women. They don't need a high IQ. They just need to be good looking. And they're going to be taken and literally watched over. Shomer Hanashim. Why do you need a bodyguard? The answer is that these women are going to be now exposed to horrific conditions. And of course they want to run home. And of course the 9-year-olds are going to be crying themselves to sleep every night. V'naton tamrokehen. Wait, v'naton tamrokehen. All they receive are cosmetics. No food. They're given cosmetics. V'anara asher tita b'nei hamelech timloch tachat Vashti v'yitav hadavar b'nei hamelech v'yasken. The king approves of this plan. After all, Nebuchadnezzar had already executed something very similar. And the women who can survive on basic cosmetics, and that already tells you that they they have the strength to potentially be the queen. That's why we need to hear about Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habira. We need to hear about Mordechai, who is Omein et Hadassah hi Esther, back to Daniel and his Persian name Belshazzar, Bat Dodo. She is his cousin, Ki ein la avaim, v'na'ara yefat toar v'tovat mar'eh. And this is where we hear that she is good looking. Oh no, she meets those qualifications of the king, just like Daniel. Uvemot avia v'imal l'kacha Mordechai lo levat. And Mordechai took her as his own daughter. And I can imagine that Mordechai tried to protect her. That Mordechai said, when the Persian officers come looking for you, can go hide under the bed, hide in the closet. I may have to go out for a little while to collect some potatoes from outside the ghetto walls. But can you, Esther, protect yourself? I can imagine, Vayhi b'shamad var hamelech v'dato, uvihi kavetz na'arot rabot el Shushan habira. Notice the terminology. They're collected. They're collected like objects. There really is a roll call for them. They're all going to be abducted. They don't want to leave their homes to go to Hegai. Vatilakach Esther. This is not a beauty contest. This really is a concentration camp. That Esther is taken el Beit HaMelech, el Yad Hegai Shomer Hanashim. And we'll prove it right now with the resonance to the story of Daniel. Vatitav hanara be'inav, vatisach chesed lefanav, exactly as we find by Daniel. Vayivahel et hamrukeha. Now this is a little strange. And Hegai gives her cosmetics bibehala, basically in a hurry. Ve'et manoteha latetla. Wait, and he gives her manot? No one gets manot. Everyone only gets tamrukim, cosmetics. Somehow, Esther has manot, which in the context of Sefer Daniel means vayiman, means amana of ochel, just as we find also in Sefer Shmuel, that Elkanah gives Chana ishto mana achat apayim. He gives her a double portion. We're talking about food. Somehow Esther ends up with food in a hurry, bibehala, through Hegai. And she's also given her sheva na'arot haruyot latet la mi beit hamelech vayishaneha vet na'aroteha leto beit hanashim. And Esther lo higida et ama vet moladeta ki Mordechai tiva aleha asher lo tagid. And here we see that Esther follows commands. She follows what Mordechai tells her. Why? Because uvachol yom bayom Mordechai mitalech lefnei chatzar beit hanashim ladat et shlom Esther uma ya'aseba. He walks by the barbed wire, lahavdil, and he wants to see what's going on with Esther. How's she doing? Is she surviving? Is someone trying to kill her so that they have a better chance of becoming queen? Because otherwise you live your life out in the harem and you die there and you can't establish a family there. This is horrific. Just as by Daniel and his peers, we saw that it was a 2-3 year process of literally persecution before we see who survives. By Esther, it's Shneim Asar Chodesh. Not only do we have that word by Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, but we also have it back in Sefer Breshit with regard to literally the embalming process, because that's what happened. Now we understand this all the more. These poor women are starved, so that ultimately they're going to sit in baths of oil and spices and basically be embalmed as living mummies. This is real torture. She basically has no fat, but she is going to be swollen up with perfumes, and that's how she comes very fragrant to the king. And she basically gets one last request to come to the king, because you can imagine none of these women want to come to the king. It really is a death wish. That means come to the king, and then after that, you're sent back to the harem, but not the harem of 12 months. You're sent back to Shesh Gaz. You're sent back to the prison harem, where there are limited resources, and basically it's every woman surviving on their own. Most women do not make it out of this harem. בערב היא באה, בבוקר היא שבה אל בית נשים, שני על יד ששגז, סריס המלך, שומר הפילגשים, then you're a pilegish for life. You're just a concubine, and you will never be invited back in the king's palace unless he knows your name. What are the chances? If there are going to be thousands of women, and keep in mind that this starts literally in the 3rd year of Ahasuerus, and Esther is only coronated in the 7th year. So this goes on for minimally 4 years. Really, one can say that the first year, they're all being prepped up to going to appear before the king. But even after Esther is already queen, we still hear Bitasef that there are still women who are being collected to the house of the king. We hear that it's time for Esther, Ubahagiat, or Esther bat Avichail, Dod Mordechai, Asher lakach lo levat lavo al hamelech, lo biksha davar, Kemet asher yomar hegais ris hamelech shomer hanashim, Vati Esther. And now we know that in Sefer Daniel it said that Elokim was the reason behind the noseit chen be'inei kol roeha. Here, Esther can't say it was Elokim, but there's clearly resonance to the Daniel story. So this is her way of telling you, please know that I know that Hashem is behind the story. Vati lakach Esther al hamelech Achashverosh shel beit malchuto b'chodesh hasiri hu chodesh Tevet. Just to remind everyone that we know from Sefer Yechezkel that chodesh Tevet is not just the month that we're familiar with in Sefer Yirmiyahu as the month of the beginning of the siege of Asara b'Tevet. So there's clearly an allusion to this very dark month, not only dark seasonally, but dark historically. But we also know that Tevet is the worst month for Jews living in Babylonia because it was on the 5th day of Tevet when a refugee came to tell the Jews in Babylonia, Yechezkel in particular, that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So basically, for Jews in Babylonia, their Tisha B'Av is basically Tevet. And in this month of Tevet, Esther is taken to her own mini Chorban, literally in the 7th year. But then, Vayahav Hamelech et Esther mikol hanashim, Vatisachen v'chesed, not just chen, but chesed, we're told, is really the secret of her survival. She carries the chesed lefanav mikol habetulot vayasam keter malchut barosha vayamlichaha tachat Vashti. What is the secret of these manot? The secret of these manot is so significant that we find that at the end of Megillat Esther, when the days of Purim have to be recorded, what does Mordechai establish? He says it's not enough that there should be days of celebration, Yom Mishteh v'Simcha, but rather it should be days of, as the Yehudim establish, days of Simcha v'Mishteh v'Yom Tov, u'mishloach manot ish l'reyehu. There should be mishlochei manot, send manot. Interesting. Mordechai is also going to not only institute these mishlochei manot, but also matanot le'evyonim. Okay, I understand everyone giving alms to the poor, making sure that everyone can celebrate, but why mishlochei manot? What does that have to do with the story of Purim? After all, why do they have to celebrate literally mishteh through drinking wine? Why do we have till today a mitzvah of su'udah, of adalo yada, chayev inish lebesume bepuraya? Why do we have that obligation to remember the means through which the miracle came about? Namely, through the wine, through the feast. So we have to have su'udah, we have to have wine. We read the Megillah to remember the story. We are going to give matanot levunim to make sure that we're all going to be unified. And certainly one can argue that the matanot le'evyonim reminds us even of how Esther provided for the evyon, Mordechai with clothing, a lot of clothing and helping in society. Okay, but why do we have to send care packages one to the other? Why do we each have to send mishlochei manot? As we know, the halacha is that each person is required to send 2 manot to another person. But if Reuven gives 2 manot to Shimon, and then Shimon gives 2 manot to Reuven, or even if Shimon gives 2 manot to Levi, what does one really gain from that? After all, you're just sharing food. These are care packages. These are sending gift baskets. And we already know from Sefer Nehemiah that this was a way that people celebrated holidays. They did. Nehemiah sends them back on Rosh Hashanah, and he says, today is not a day for crying. Rather, that you should go and have a joint su'udah, a potluck meal. So one can argue that this is merely an expression of the establishment of a holiday. But it seems that it's added on. It's added as a way of remembering the miracle. Send manot. if we look back, but only if we know the story of Daniel. The only way that special Manot, the only way that Manot make it in the palace of Babylonia and Persia is if there's someone on the inside who's providing the Manot. The Sar HaSarisim in Daniel does not want to risk his life and provide special manot. It's only the Meltzar that's willing to do it because he knows he's going to gain something from this. So now we turn back to the story of Esther in the court, literally in the prison, and we hear Vayivahel, that Haggai gives her tamrukim and manot. Why does Haggai give her tamrukim and manot? Why is Haggai, the eunuch, going to risk his life and do this? Because the next pasuk tells us that Mordechai is there. Our sense is that Mordechai probably bribes Haggai, just as we find Daniel, to a certain degree, bribes the Meltzar, and basically says, you have what to gain. You provide me with manot, with special food portions. Esther says, you know the story. So when you see that Haggai gives Esther food, again, that's her secret of survival. Why is she the one who's going to carry chen? Because she also has the chesed, not just her own chesed, the chesed of Mordechai, who literally walked by the barbed wire fence and probably wrapped up $100 bill around a Hershey kiss. Please pardon the anachronism. But basically, then snuck it under to Haggai, who quickly gave her her cosmetics and then took the $100 bill, but at the same time put the Hershey Kiss into her little sachet of blush and eyeshadow. Basically, those are the tamrukim and manot. Now we understand that why did Esther survive? Because she had manot. She literally looked healthier, just like Daniel and her friends and his friends. And therefore, it's essential that we understand these allusions of Esther to Daniel. She says, come on, you know that story. And therefore, if you know that story, you know that you can only survive with the help of Elohim, but also with the help of the internal people who are going to be bribing, who are going to make sure that you have the little manot. And you know what? Maybe these manot really weren't the most nutritious foods, just like by Daniel. Basically, they were seeds. But when Mordechai gives them to her, they're also an expression of chesed. It's a reminder to her that, Esther, I know that you're no longer at home. I know that you're outside of the ghetto. I know that you're all alone. And I know that it literally is a life-threatening situation. But I'm here on the other side of the fence, and I'm providing you with manot. I'm providing you with that little Hershey kiss. I'm providing you with that reminder that I love you and that I care about you. And therefore, the Megillah goes out of its way to tell us that part of the celebration of Purim is mishloach manot. Here we're going to prove it. Ish l're'ehu. Ish l're'ehu, strange terminology. It should just say, mishloach manot le'inachon lo, like it does in Nehemiah. Send to whomever you want. No. Send mishloach manot that remind you of Ish. Who's the Ish in Megillat Esther? Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira u'shmo Mordechai. Remember the manot and send the manot the same way that Ish, the same way that Mordechai sent them to Lire'ehu, who is the Ish L'Re'ehu, who is the Re'ah, the same person that you should give the Malchut to, as mentioned in Perek Aleph of Megillat Esther, Pasuk Yutet, that Umalchuta Yitain HaMelech Liru'uta HaTova Mimena, who is the Re'ah that ultimately is going to succeed Vashti. The Re'ah is none other than Esther. Esther is saying, please read my story in lieu of Sefer Daniel. Please read my story and understand the secret of survival. Do you know what enabled me to survive? She says. Do you know how I was able to be selected as the queen? Because of chen and chesed. How did I have that chen? How did I literally have the countenance when all these hundreds and thousands of young women, young girls were starved? The answer is, mishloach manot ish l're'ehu. Remember those manot. Remember those food portions. Remember that intervention of the Ish of Mordechai. To me, the Re'ah, the Re'uta HaTova Mimena, who was selected as queen because I had that food and I had that chesed. What Mordechai and Esther are teaching us is that in order to remember the story, in order to remember the miracle, you have to remember the chesed. You must remember the manot. What they're teaching us is that the secret to survival in Galut, the way that Daniel succeeds, Hanania, Mishael, Azariah, is not just devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but devotion to the basic principles and values of Judaism. Daniel doesn't eat from the patpat hamelech because it's not kosher, but because it's literally and disgusting to him. It completely undermines the way that he was raised, the values and the principles. Esther retells her story in a very similar way, and she says that the secret of my personal survival that must be perpetuated when you remember the story and the miracle of Purim are basically those small miracles that are performed ben ish l'reyehu, those small miracles which are literally the small acts of kindness, the small acts of kindness that we hear during the Shoah, the small acts of kindness that we hear about between hostages since October 7th. These are the small acts of kindnesses, literally the Manot, ish l'reyehu, that keep Esther alive, that reminds us of chesed. These are the acts of kindness that can save someone's life. And sometimes it really is a manna. It's a portion, it's a nourishment that we send on Purim to remember how the miracle came about. And sometimes it can be a smile in the hallway. This is the takeaway of Megillat Esther. If you know the secret of Sefer Daniel, if you understand the significance of Mishloach Manot Ish L'Reyehu. Hopefully, not only will this Purim be a little different this year, but hopefully we'll remember how these little acts of chesed can truly save lives. Wishing all of you not just a wonderful Purim, but perhaps your Mishloach Manot will be a little more meaningful day in and day out.
Thank you for joining us for Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin. This series is presented by Matan and World Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. We hope today's conversation inspired you, sparked new ideas, and deepened your connection to the text and its meaning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family who would appreciate these conversations. Your support helps us continue bringing thoughtful, meaningful Torah to the wider audience. We look forward to learning together again soon. See you in the next episode of Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin.